Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're watching this, it's probably late, maybe very late. You've got your pillow adjusted just right, the room is dark enough, and you've decided that what you really need right now, what will finally carry you off to sleep, is a slow, unhurried walk through the life of one of history's most spectacularly unhinged emperors. So, settle in, pull the blanket up. We're drifting back tonight to ancient Rome, 1st century AD, a city of about 1 million people, most of whom were trying their best not to accidentally annoy the man in charge. Tonight, that man is Nero. Full name, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, which is, of course, an enormous number of names for someone who would eventually lose control of basically everything. Now, before we get into the murders and the fires and the general atmosphere of imperial chaos, I want to do something that people rarely bothered to do with Nero. I want to start at the beginning. Because Nero didn't simply appear one day, fully formed, wearing a toga and looking for someone to blame. He was shaped, slowly and somewhat inevitably, by one of the most dysfunctional families the ancient world had ever produced. And that's saying something. The Romans set a very high bar for family dysfunction. So let's begin where Nero began, in a bloodline that was already, by any reasonable measure, deeply compromised. Nero was born on December 15th in the year 37 AD. His mother was Agrippina the Younger. His father was a man named Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, whose name translates loosely to bronze beard, which does tell you something about Roman naming conventions, though not much about the man himself. What does tell you something about the man is the ancient historian Suetonius, who described Ahenobarbus as, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, a man who was contemptible in every aspect of his life. He allegedly ran over a child in the road with his chariot just to see what would happen. He gouged out the eye of a Roman knight in the forum for arguing with him. He was charged with treason, adultery, and incest at various points. And when someone congratulated him on the birth of his son, Nero's father reportedly said that any child born of himself and Agrippina could only ever be a horror and a public calamity. Which is a remarkable thing to say about your own newborn, and also, in fairness, fairly accurate. Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a different kind of problem entirely. She was brilliant, she was ruthless, she was ambitious in the way that only someone who has survived the court of Caligula can be ambitious, which is to say, with a complete and total disregard for the well-being of anyone who stood in her way. She was also the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, which made her bloodline enormously valuable and also enormously dangerous. In Rome, being related to Augustus was like being holding a golden ticket that also had a reasonable chance of getting you killed. And the family she came from, the Julio-Claudians, were, as a dynasty, a case study in what happens when power concentrates in a gene pool for too long. We have Augustus, who was calculating and cold, his successor, Tiberius, who became a paranoid recluse, then Caligula, who needs very little introduction, then Claudius, who was underestimated by everyone and turned out to be surprisingly competent, though with some notable personal blind spots we'll get to, and then Nero, the last of them. Each one a little more unraveled than the last, as if the dynasty itself was slowly losing the thread. Nero's father died when Nero was about 3 years old. Liver failure, most likely, though in Rome you were always allowed to speculate. After that, his mother, Agrippina, was exiled by Caligula, her own brother, because she had been involved in a plot against him. Whether she actually was or not is one of those historical questions that will never quite resolve itself, but Caligula believed it, and that was sufficient. So young Nero spent a portion of his early childhood in the care of an aunt, largely ignored, in circumstances that were comfortable enough in material terms and fairly bleak in emotional ones. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, and we will not get into that tonight, that is a whole other evening's worth of material, his uncle Claudius became emperor. Claudius recalled Agrippina from exile. She came back, and she came back with a plan. Agrippina the Younger is one of those historical figures who is genuinely difficult to look away from, even when you want to. She was, by every account, extraordinarily capable. She managed political alliances like a chess player manages pieces, deliberately, patiently, with at least 3 moves planned ahead. She was also, by every account, someone you absolutely did not want to cross or disappoint or be the obstacle of. When she returned from exile, Nero was a small child. She had plans for him that he was not yet old enough to understand or resist, which was, from her perspective, ideal. Claudius was emperor. He was also a widower, his previous wife Messalina having been executed for, depending on who you ask, either a genuine conspiracy against him or simply for being too flamboyant about her various extracurricular activities, possibly both. Claudius, now alone and in need of a wife, looked around at his options. His niece, Agrippina, made herself one of those options. And Claudius, who was a man of many intellectual gifts and apparently somewhat fewer personal ones, agreed. So Agrippina married her uncle, Claudius, in the year 49 AD. The Romans were not entirely comfortable with this. Uncle-niece marriages were not traditional, even by Roman standards, which is a sentence that requires a moment to absorb. But Claudius passed a law making such marriages legal, because when you are the emperor, that is something you can do, and it speaks volumes about the specific nature of the problems you have created for yourself. Once married to Claudius, Agrippina moved quickly. She convinced Claudius to adopt Nero as her son, giving him the imperial name and bumping him ahead of Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus, in the line of succession. She arranged for Nero to be tutored by the philosopher Seneca, which is honestly one of the more inspired choices in this entire story. Seneca was patient, thoughtful, deeply educated, and was about to have the most exhausting job in the Roman Empire. She also arranged for Nero at 15 to marry Claudius's daughter, Octavie, his stepsister. The family was keeping things, as was customary for dynasties of this era, very much in-house. Claudius died in the year 54 AD. He was, depending on your source, either poisoned with mushrooms or simply had the misfortune of eating bad mushrooms at dinner. Agrippina was widely suspected of the former. The timing was, let us say, convenient. Nero was 16 years old and suddenly the emperor of Rome. There was a famous joke that circulated afterward that mushrooms were the food of the gods because eating one had
made Claudius a god. Romans, always with the dark humor. Nero's first years as emperor were, and this surprises people, relatively decent ones. This is the part of Nero's story that tends to get glossed over in favor of the more colorful later period, but it deserves at least a quiet mention. Under the guidance of Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, the young emperor initially behaved himself with something approaching responsibility. There were reasonable policies. There was a period of what historians sometimes call the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years of Nero, tax reforms, legal improvements, a general atmosphere of, relatively speaking, competence. But ruling competently was never going to be enough for Agrippina. She had not maneuvered through the courts of Caligula and Claudius, had not arranged marriages and adoptions and, quite possibly, mushroom-related deaths just to watch her son take reasonable positions on tax law. She wanted power. Specifically, she wanted to exercise it through him. And Nero, now that he was emperor, was beginning to form his own opinions about that arrangement. The conflict between them started quietly. A disagreement over a freed slave Nero had grown attached to, a woman named Acte, whom he had taken as a lover and whom Agrippina deeply disapproved of. Not on moral grounds, she was well past those, but on practical ones. Acte was nobody. She was a distraction. Agrippina wanted her son focused. She made her displeasure known, and Nero, raised by this woman, educated by her choices, elevated by her ambition, told her in the most polite terms available that she could mind her own business, which was exactly the kind of response Agrippina had not prepared herself for. There is a particular kind of dynamic that develops between very controlling parents and the children they have raised to be powerful. Eventually, the child figures out that they are, in fact, powerful, and that moment tends to go badly for everyone. For Nero and Agrippina, that moment arrived gradually,
Then, all at once, Agrippina was not a woman who accepted reduced influence gracefully. When she found herself being edged out of her son's decision-making, she did what came naturally to her. She threatened to support someone else. Specifically, she made noises about Britannicus, Claudius's actual biological son, who was still alive and still technically had a claim to the throne. This was not a subtle move. It was the political equivalent of someone standing in your living room, pointing meaningfully at the door. Nero's response to this particular threat was to have Britannicus poisoned at dinner. The boy was 13 years old. The poison was reportedly so effective that Britannicus simply slumped over at the table and died, and Nero told the assembled guests that the boy had been prone to fits and not to worry about it. Nobody pushed back on this. In the court of a Roman emperor, you learned very quickly not to ask follow-up questions. Agrippina was reportedly shaken by this, not by the morality of it, she was not that kind of shocked, but because it demonstrated clearly that her son was no longer someone she could threaten without consequence. She had, perhaps it was dawning on her, created something that she could no longer fully control. She retreated somewhat. Nero's relationship with her cooled into an uneasy coexistence. He moved her out of the imperial palace, stopped consulting her. She was still his mother, she still had influence, but it was the kind of influence that reminded him of her presence rather than actually shaping his decisions. Meanwhile, Nero was discovering things he enjoyed that had nothing to do with governance. He liked chariot racing, he liked music. He had convinced himself he was a gifted singer and poet. Seneca was, throughout this period, doing what patient tutors of powerful people have done throughout history, which is nodding carefully and choosing his words with great precision. Nero also had the emperor's prerogative of taking up essentially any hobby with unlimited resources, which in his case meant increasingly elaborate theatrical performances in which he participated personally. He would perform on stage in front of audiences. This was considered for Roman aristocratic standards mortifying. Emperors were not supposed to perform. They were supposed to look dignified and make decisions. Nero found this expectation boring, which gives you some sense of where things were heading. By 59 AD, Nero had had enough of his mother. He decided to have her killed. The method he initially chose was, and I want you to appreciate this, a collapsible boat. The plan was to invite Agrippina for a pleasant evening, put her on a specially designed boat that would conveniently sink in the middle of the bay, and let the water take care of the rest. The boat was rigged. She got on it. The boat collapsed on schedule. Agrippina, who was either an exceptionally strong swimmer or simply the kind of person who refused to die inconveniently, swam to shore. She sent a message to Nero informing him that she had survived the accident and was grateful for his concern. Nero, upon receiving this message, reportedly panicked. He called in his advisors. Seneca and Burrus looked at each other with the expression of men who had seen too much. The decision was made. Soldiers were sent to Agrippina's house. She died there that night, and, according to the historian Tacitus, her last words to the soldiers were to strike her in the womb that had borne Nero. Whether she actually said this or whether Tacitus was editorializing somewhat is unclear, but it has the ring of Agrippina's particular flavor of drama, so perhaps we give it the benefit of the doubt. Afterwards, Nero supposedly said that he hadn't realized his mother was so beautiful. After his mother's death, something in Nero, possibly a tether to whatever remained of ordinary imperial behavior, seems to have loosened significantly. He was 21 years old. He was emperor of Rome, and he was increasingly committed to the idea that his true calling was the arts. Now, this in itself is not necessarily a sign of madness. Plenty of rulers have had artistic ambitions. The problem was the combination of Nero's genuine enthusiasm, his complete lack of self-awareness about his actual talent level, and the fact that absolutely nobody around him could tell him he was bad at it. Because he was the emperor, and emperors who killed their own mothers were not, as a general rule, the kind of people you offered constructive criticism to. Nero sang. He played the cithara, a sort of ancient lyre.
He competed in artistic festivals, he wrote poetry, he performed publicly in theaters, which continued to horrify the Roman senatorial class in ways they could only quietly whisper about over wine when they were very sure the room was not being listened to. He went on a grand tour of Greece in 66 to 67 AD, specifically to compete in the Greek games, the Olympics, the Pythian Games, others. He entered every competition. He won every competition. This was, of course, not entirely coincidental. Judges at these events had a reasonably acute survival instinct. If Nero entered a chariot race and fell out of his chariot and didn't finish, which is apparently what happened at the Olympics, he was still awarded the victory on the grounds that he would have won if he had managed to stay in the chariot.
The Greeks, historically gracious hosts, handed him over 212 victory crowns by the time he went home. Nero declared it a triumph. He also freed all of Greece from Roman taxation during this visit, which was either genuine generosity or the sort of dramatic gesture that plays well to a crowd of people you've just given 1,000 gold crowns to, possibly both. Back in Rome, his reign had become increasingly erratic. His first wife, Octavia, had been divorced and then, when simply being divorced proved insufficient, executed on manufactured charges of adultery. His second wife, Poppaea Sabina, was a woman he had genuinely seemed to love, or at least to love as much as someone like Nero was capable of loving anything. She was beautiful, politically astute, and by most accounts something of an influence on him. She died in 65 AD. Nero later claimed he had kicked her to death in a rage. Some historians think this may be later slander rather than fact, but the circumstances remain murky, which is its own kind of answer. He married a third time to a woman named Statilia Messalina while Poppaea was barely cold. He also, in a development that even by Nero's standards requires a moment of quiet pause, married a young man named Sporus, whom he had castrated because the boy resembled Poppaea. He called Sporus by Poppaea's name. He brought him to official functions as his wife. Seneca, who had been trying to manage Nero's excesses with increasing desperation, was by this point forced to retire and eventually accused of involvement in an assassination plot. He was ordered to commit suicide. He did, famously, with great philosophical dignity. It took a while. The details, which Tacitus provides in considerable depth, are not ideal for a sleep script, so we'll simply note that Seneca died as he had lived, with more composure than anyone around him deserved. The Pisonian conspiracy of 65 AD, the plot Seneca was accused of participating in, was a broad and not particularly well-organized attempt by members of the Roman elite to replace Nero with someone more stable. It failed, mostly because the conspirators were not especially discreet. Nero's response was to execute a very large number of people, including several prominent senators, writers, and military figures. The poet Lucan, who had been one of Nero's favorites before the relationship soured, was among them. Also forced to die, also did so by opening his veins, because that was the official methodology of the period, and reciting his own poetry as he went, which tells you something about poets. We have to talk about the fire. In July of 64 AD, a fire broke out in Rome. It started near the Circus Maximus in the Merchant District, and it spread, and spread, and kept spreading for about 6 days before it was brought under partial control. Then it flared up again. By the time it was truly over, roughly 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been damaged or destroyed. It was one of the worst urban disasters in Roman history. And the story everyone knows, that Nero played his fiddle while Rome burned, is almost certainly not true. For one thing, the fiddle hadn't been invented yet. For another, Nero was reportedly at his villa in Antium, about 30 miles away when the fire started. When he heard, he returned to Rome. He organized relief efforts. He opened his own palaces and gardens to house displaced citizens. He brought in food supplies. He personally surveilled the ruins to help with recovery planning. This is not typically how the story is told. The story that was told then and afterward was that Nero had actually set the fire himself to clear land for an enormous new palace complex he wanted to build, and it stood on a tower playing his instrument and singing while the city burned. The new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, was indeed built on land cleared by the fire, and it was indeed extravagant beyond measure. It had a rotating dining room ceiling, a colossal statue of Nero himself at the entrance, artificial lakes, walls covered in gold leaf and mother of pearl. It was, in the words of various ancient commentators, a lot.
Whether he set the fire or simply benefited from it with impressive speed is a question history has not resolved. What Nero did in the immediate aftermath was find someone to blame. He settled on the Christians, a small and generally misunderstood group in Rome at the time. Nero accused them of starting the fire and proceeded to persecute them with notable enthusiasm. They were burned alive, they were thrown to animals, they were used as human torches to illuminate his garden parties. It was, by any measure, a low point. The Great Fire and its aftermath did enormous damage to Nero's reputation, and it was already a reputation that had been weathering some serious structural concerns. The senatorial class, which had been losing members to his paranoia for years, was increasingly hostile. The legions were growing restless. Provincial governors were questioning their loyalties. By 68 AD, a governor named Galba in Spain had declared himself a servant of the Senate and people of Rome, which was the ancient equivalent of openly questioning whether the current management arrangement was working out. Other governors began to follow. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers whose entire purpose was protecting the emperor, decided their interests lay elsewhere. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. Nero, at this point, had very few friends left. His freedmen, his personal staff, were the ones who stuck with him to the end. He fled Rome with a small group of attendants. They rode through the night. He ended up at the villa of a freed slave named Phaon outside the city. He hid in a ditch. He could hear the soldiers searching nearby. He was 30 years old. He could not bring himself to do what was expected, to fall on his sword cleanly, the way Seneca had, the way Lucan had, with some version of dignity. He wept. He kept saying, apparently, "What an Argist dies in me." Finally, with the help of a secretary named Epaphroditus, the sword was positioned. He died in 68 AD, the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which ended not with a conquest or a heroic final stand, but a man hiding in a ditch mourning himself. And now we arrive at the question the title promised. Why was Nero so cruel? Because the cruelty is real. Even accounting for hostile ancient sources, even factoring in the way history tends to darken the reputation of rulers.
Who lost? The picture that emerges of Nero is not a comfortable one. He killed his mother, he killed his first wife, he killed Britannicus as a teenager, he persecuted Christians, he executed senators and poets, and people who had simply been too visible for his comfort. The cruelty is documented across multiple sources, including some that are not obviously biased against him. So where did it come from? The easy answer is his childhood, and the easy answer is not entirely wrong. Being raised by Agrippina the Younger would have been an experience designed to produce someone who was simultaneously dependent on and terrified of the concept of unconditional love. She was not, by any account, a warm parent. She was a strategic one. Nero's value to her was instrumental. He was the vehicle for her ambition, and children who grow up understanding that they are valued primarily for their utility tend to develop complicated relationships with trust and affection. His father was absent and reportedly horrible. His early years were unstable. The family he was embedded in, the Julio-Claudians, was a family defined by suspicion, violence, and the omnipresent awareness that being in the imperial family was as dangerous as it was privileged. Then he was handed the power of a god at 16, with no real preparation, and surrounded by people who needed something from him. Seneca tried. For years, Seneca genuinely tried to guide him towards something better. The early years of his reign, when Seneca and Burrus had real influence, produced real good governance. But Nero at his core did not want to be governed. He did not want to be advised. He wanted to be celebrated. He wanted to be the artist he believed himself to be, and the emperor role was something he wore rather than something he inhabited. The cruelty, when it came in cycles. Periods of relative calm followed by eruptions of violence triggered by perceived threats, real or imagined. The Pisanian conspiracy made things worse. After that, the executions became less discriminating. Fear does that to people. It did it to Tiberius, who became a paranoid recluse. It did it to Caligula. It did it to Nero. There is also the factor that historians sometimes underweight, which is the structural violence of the position itself. Roman emperors existed in an environment where their death was always being plotted by someone. This was not paranoia, it was accurate. Multiple emperors were assassinated.
The rational response to living in that environment for someone without a very stable psychological foundation to begin with was to lash out before being lashed at. The killings made sense to Nero in a way they probably wouldn't make sense to us, and that's not an excuse, just a context. And then there's the question of what we mean by cruelty. Some of what is attributed to Nero was political violence, horrible but comprehensible within its context. Some of it was personal, the wife, the mother, the various people whose deaths seem less about threat management and more about rage. That personal cruelty is harder to explain without reaching for words like personality disorder, which is a modern framework and sits awkwardly on a first-century emperor. What we can say is that Nero was a person of real enthusiasms. He genuinely loved music, genuinely engaged with art, was reportedly capable of warmth with people he felt safe with. He was not purely monstrous in the cartoonish way the popular image suggests. He was something more interesting and, in some ways, more troubling. A person of genuine capacity who was shaped by circumstance into something destructive, and who never had anyone powerful enough to pull him back from the edge once he'd found it. Let's drift a little wider now, because Nero doesn't exist in isolation. He's the last branch of a particular tree, and that tree is worth looking at in the quiet, low-lit way we look at things at this hour. The Julio-Claudians, 5 emperors: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. A dynasty that lasted from 27 BC to 68 AD. Nearly a century of continuous rule by variations on the same bloodline, each one connected to the divine Augustus through a network of adoptions, marriages, and biological relationships that becomes increasingly difficult to map without a very large piece of paper and considerable patience. Augustus himself set the pattern. He had no biological sons, so he adopted his stepson Tiberius as heir. Tiberius was a capable general who became an increasingly grim emperor. He eventually retreated to the island of Capri, from which he issued directives and allowed the city to sort of run itself, which it did, poorly, for years. He had developed the habit of executing people for treason on relatively thin evidence, and the Senate had developed the habit of going along with this, which is a dynamic that tends not to improve once established. Caligula followed. He was the son of the popular general Germanicus, and his early reign was marked by genuine public affection and what seemed like the promise of a fresh start. Then, a few months in, something happened, possibly illness, possibly the accumulated psychological weight of having grown up in the court of Tiberius, where everyone he'd loved had been destroyed, and he became the Caligula of legend, the one who appointed his horse as a priest, who declared himself a living god, who had people executed for smiling at the wrong moment. He lasted about 4 years before being assassinated by members of his own Praetorian Guard, who had frankly had enough. Claudius came next, chosen more or less because he was there, and because he was underestimated enough that the Praetorian Guard thought he'd be manageable. He wasn't quite. He turned out to be a serious scholar, a capable administrator, and someone who managed to expand the empire while also writing historical treatises. His problem was his wives, or specifically his last 2. Messalina, who may have actually attempted a coup while he was absent, and then Agrippina, who definitely had him killed. He was, in retrospect, a reasonable emperor who had very bad luck in the personal dimension of his life. And then Nero, who closed the enterprise. After Nero, Rome entered the year of the 4 emperors, which is exactly what it sounds like. 4 different men declared themselves emperor within approximately 12 months. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, who was actually competent, and who founded the Flavian dynasty and restored a degree of institutional sanity to the position. The Colosseum was built under Vespasian, or rather it was begun under Vespasian, on land that had been the artificial lake of Nero's Golden House, which is a kind of historical justice that Rome seemed to specialize in. The damage Nero did to the institution of the emperorship was in some ways less about the specific horrors of his reign and more about the precedent it set. He demonstrated conclusively that the emperor could be incompetent, unstable, and dangerous, and that the system had no reliable mechanism for removing him. The Senate could declare him an enemy, the Guard could switch allegiances, governors could rebel, But none of these things happened until they happened, and in the years between Nero becoming obviously unfit and Nero actually losing power, a lot of people died who shouldn't have. Later emperors, the good ones anyway, seemed to absorb this lesson. The so-called 5 good emperors of the 2nd century, from Nerva through Marcus Aurelius, were generally chosen on merit, at least partly, and adopted rather than inherited. They governed with something closer to actual governance. Historians look back on that period as something of a high point, but it was built in the shadow of what the Julio-Claudians had demonstrated was possible, and I think that shadow mattered. The reputation of Nero in the ancient sources is, it must be said, not a neutral one. Our main sources for his reign, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, are writing after his death, under later emperors who had political reasons to paint the Julio-Claudians in unflattering colors. This doesn't mean they invented things, but it does mean that the most lurid details were preserved, amplified, and in some cases probably embellished. Suetonius, who wrote The Lives of the 12 Caesars about 50 years after Nero's death, gives us the most colorful portrait. He's the one who records Nero's various alleged atrocities in the most vivid detail. He's also a writer who understood that vivid detail was interesting, and that interesting sold manuscripts, so we take him with some appropriate seasoning. Tacitus is more complex. He was writing his annals in the early 2nd century, and he was deeply hostile to the Principate, the system of government the emperors represented, in a philosophical sense, even while acknowledging it was necessary. His portrait of Nero captures real complexity, the early promise, the deterioration, and the role of people like Agrippina and Seneca in shaping the disaster. His Nero is more human, and therefore in some ways harder to excuse. Early Christian writers remembered Nero as the first persecutor of their faith, and his reputation in that tradition was, understandably, not favorable. Some early Christian texts may even have used Nero or Neron as coded references in apocalyptic writing. The number 666 in the Book of Revelation has been interpreted by some scholars as a numerological reference to his name in a particular ancient coding system. Whether that's accurate is something theologians and historians argue about, but it illustrates how thoroughly he had become, even within a generation of his death, a symbol of something. Interestingly, there was a persistent popular belief in the eastern parts of the empire, in Greece, in Asia Minor, that Nero hadn't really died, that he had fled east and would return. There were at least 3 impostors who appeared in the decades after his death claiming to be Nero, and each attracted a genuine following. The last of these appeared something like 20 years after his death. People believed. In a world without photographs or rapid communication, and in a world where Nero had genuinely been loved in the Greek East for his theatrical patronage and his dramatic tax exemption, the idea that he had escaped and might come back had a certain appeal. He was, in short, more complicated than the villain the history books generally need him to be. Not innocent, not misunderstood in the sense of being harmless, but a person whose story is woven through with circumstances that shaped him, with institutional failures that enabled him, and with a system of power that had no good answer to the question of what to do when the person at its center was neither wise nor stable.